Good morning.
So yes, hi everyone. It's so good to see you. I'm really excited. It's really good to see you even over Zoom. And I would love if we could also get tea or something like that. But for now, I'm really happy to see you this way.
Keranzo ane tangos je marwa Zoom ne thongu yori ineya thonga de pe go chung song swa ane keranzo lia lupti che lia takalor pe ngamgudus swa. Yes.
So for today, we are going to start off with some introduction. So right now, this is year 4, so you'll be learning about developmental biology and physiology. But today I'm going to do a little bit of review of the previous years.
Tachnang lorim shiwadi thanda kebel rikpata lingkham rikparedwa. Wondenje imbayna ya ane theringi lopsen dinang lo ya angonzo ngama dewa jangyo dende khasi skyarjong chi yeswa. Yes.
And first I have just one quick slide to introduce myself. I think I have met many of you before, but maybe not all of you. So these are just a couple of pictures that I picked out because I think they kind of show my own development as a scientist over the years.
아니 델레야 gelagi pari khasi chirwa gela korang mangbo jiliya ngene tu yore sina khasi jiliya thengma thangbo tu yedi ani gela ngote che da nyamdo gela korangi siri bajigin bechane chigi ya salong chongda jorwa dida jawata chine ani gelagi lo yute gi cheto delya pari khasi chu sen sha yes ra.
And in several of these photos, so the one that says like age 21 and age 23 and age 28. All during that time, I was doing genetics research.
다 gelai tipari khashi shwa pensional lo ni sa chi re chan chaksum le bare chapye imbindi ta dinang la liya ani gelai ta khalor ta mejinang la liya ta nanga cheshiro ta khalor deni roz ko de wai jureswa.
And then you can see in this last one, that's a picture of some of my time at Emory. And since then, I think as a lot of you know, I got to actually come stay in India for a while. And then now, currently, I'm a professor in California.
Didi gela lo ni sabye le imbe kapsi di par di Emory la ya jureswa. Tidi ene dada delia ani nganzo dine bha dungi Emory ki nyam memory dungi nyam de par jadwa tudi phege le ya ani ki genge charo nanga de yor tende nang yu wake up stress di je le ya ani jaga le ya le ande ne chinta thanda na ki gen le phege California le ya ani ki gen chimbo nang ne digi yes kila.
And some exciting news is that pretty soon I'll actually be returning to Emory, so I'll be back in Atlanta.
Oh, the Galilea Nezusa color Nezusawa Yapush Katel and the Galapeche Emory La Paranjagun Pay in Sang Atlanta Emory is such a mean Atlanta Imba Atlanta Paranjagun Isra.
All right, so that's my introduction. And for this, I wanted to let you all know just how the rest of the biology sessions would go. So like I said, right now we're in physiology and development. And after today, you'll have 3 sessions with Jacob talking about physiology.
Tadi di lingkam rikpata kipe rikparedwa. Di lo shiwed lorim shiwed nang lo ya di kharla bana lopse di khandes chigni khuji dunda chik ta nimani sumsyor di khandes chigni gori shiwe merwa thangbo di gelai nanga ya redwa tharing go gela nangara di jele ya ane Jacob gelai ni seanga zatu zap din khasa konda zatu zap din zap ye Jacob ki ne lingkam rikbe kang li nangara physiology che ande di masangma mg da gela ena dela shudwa. Yes.
And then we'll have 4 sessions about development and reproduction with Anna, who is actually here. So maybe Anna, if you could just kind of quick say hi and do a wave so everybody can see you, and then they'll get to see you more later this or next week.
Hello, everybody. I'm excited to join. I'm so pleased to be teaching you. Some of you again, and some of you, I think, for the first time.
아니 단다 예수는 시탄기 기베릭바당 아니 차베릭바디 Dr. Anna lai nangarwa ani Dr. Anna la de shuyoris ani Dr. Anna lai khalsons lana ani khiran samli ya samdi da cheni ani khiran so le la be shu ngam gudus kala pe la be ko ka bra da pe go chongson khashish le nga gelang ngani thema khashish tonyo yo ine khashish sawi chagi gires.
Great. Okay, so here we are in day 1 of biology, session 1. And I know you all have had many other days and sessions and other topics, but for now, we'll get to start our review of evolution.
다 먼저 님은 당부 깽이 님은 당부 시체 엔 속대 당부도 셔요와 다 셴반절에 gel에 페이지 페이 말이나요 아니 님은 당부에 속대 당부도 걸이야 먼저 가르치기는 기베릭 받아 저와 evolution 시에디 기베릭 바임바 기베릭 당 안저와 유기 강리야 결정치기스.
And since I know many of you were part of the evolution class a couple of years ago, I'm going to start with asking you all a question, and you can discuss this with someone that you're sitting next to. But the question is just to think of what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about studying biological evolution?
가시 아니 거스 진달이야 뭐마 럼요요레스와 게라 코라 마레 친 럼요요레 가시 양 진달이야 게라 럼요요 마레 디인디 다 게라기 당보데 티워스 당기 인스와 티워디 카릴라베나 이 깽의 깨벨 리과요와 깨벨 리과스에 디 삼로 코리온디 케랑기 셈 나올이야 당슈 가르체 연구도스 온디디 인 케란소기 로바 년람레 용에디 좀 추두르치다스와 the kipel request the evolution biology evolution say the koada ani keran su sem nang la thema thangshi 가르치는 것도.
Yeah, so we'll take just a couple minutes so everybody can talk, and then that way we can share back a couple of the things that came to mind.
Okay, sure. 아니 그만 가시 계란 수 안을 계란 수 주도로 지역이 뒤지기는 엔진이 먼저 야 냠도 시에 있어. 폐교릭 바르다 폐교릭 봐. 폐교릭 봐서 디 거의 온디 가르고 가르셈 나셔거든. 폐교로 온다게 너는 기패를 나요 나 폐교르다.
How's the conversation going? I realize it's a little difficult to tell. Are they still discussing?
This I think they're ready to share their ideas.
Okay, let's hear them. Excellent.
Yeah, sure. 당보 수르메. 양답에서 당실라. 가전라는 군수 꽤 많고네. At least 미꽤 고나 디스트릭 되요래.
먼저 차봉도 누가 시샤라라 아니 그런게 아니 지신 다 디낭라 망보여라 차봉이 두배 아니 다 기원 군대 아니 랑이 리균대 아니 출라 만들어 아니 징예징라 아니 공배도 폐월체 받아
네, 필교릭 봤어야 되라. So when she hears the evolution, she thinks about the cells and then the how cells, fight in order to conserve its genes and leads to development.
Okay, yeah, and we'll definitely, especially in our second session today, we'll be talking more about genes and cells.
때 릭제고르 디치르와 아니 디고레야 아주 드링기 초된데 나는 야망아 직식이 있어. 되죠. 셴바이베.
Gela ngansogi mepo denso ancestor evolution lade ko ancestor din se dengi dilan.
Okay, so she's saying that through evolution we kind of like inherited from our ancestors.
Yes, and we're going to talk about that too. That's great. Maybe let's have. Is there one more?
양자권을 찍기 왜? 타마 찍기 왜? 당보다 뭐 하늘스 총이 메로래. So when she thinks about evolution, she thinks about how flowers and plants do kind of originated from the beginning and then came into present existence.
Okay, so maybe this is also talking about how there's a really long time.
되게 쉬운 거래요. 그래서 어쨌든 계시요. 이네 단다부터 단단하게 지식이 나라 심지에 나라 되게 ngol이야 수 용야래야 되게 쉬운 거래요. Yes.
Great. So now, thank you for sharing your ideas. I have a little bit of a list that I prepared as well, so I'll share my list with you now.
계란 속에 섬주든지 시에 터지체스로 안 gelage 럽생 가시 럽다 자와 교치는 시에 뜻이고요. 아니 단다 디스콘 땡기스.
So here's the list, and I will say most of the slides have translations. This is one of the only ones that doesn't. But I'll just briefly talk about these 4 different key concepts in evolution.
따디낭라리야 깽을 뭔다 폐교릭보다 저와 여기 내도 나가 시여도 찡이 숨시 디콜이야 아니 닝도 지라기 있어. Yes.
And all of these, I have a couple more slides, and so we'll get to actually see what all of these are. But for now, we can just know we're going to talk about 4 key concepts in evolution.
또 델리아 주시리리리리야 아니 gelagi tinde shtagalangzo 년동 뜨디 때야죠 봐망 같이 수요요 수와 아니 디다 저와요 치는 거서 드리고 나 룹티치기스.
All right, so the first one is phylogenetic trees.
또 당보디 소대 페림기 동보세시도아 데레 켄세 단다 phylogenetic 세디 소대 페림기 동보세드레 아니 테모마인 베 소대 페림기 동보콜이야 아니 gelag지시기스 라. Yes.
And because I can see mostly everyone, if a phylogenetic tree looks familiar, could you just raise your hand so I can see?
소대 단다 소대 페림기 동보세시도아 디 딩은의 고뇨여와다야 티 시그니처로즈 알레덴데로지 삼삼로지 여기나 라바양다스 gelagi 통ye trososa 그래서 신규나 하고나 I can see 6 or 7 people raising their hands.
Okay, great. So we'll talk about them a little bit more since this is sort of a key tool in evolution.
당아 저디콜이야 뜻식망을 라기 가질라나 디디 아니 폐교릭 배낭로리야 내가 치슈로 지크와 내든 치슈 직착이랬어.
Okay. So I know that we heard the idea of ancestors in terms of evolution, and phylogenetic trees are a way of looking at the common ancestors for different organisms.
따당기 소대 페림기 동보세시도아 디기 아니 가르케 시용 걸라디 간조 딴 심제 용에 창막이로와 아니 투몽기 메보 간에 총에서 디코를 기지시게레스 그래서 yes
And
투몽기 sorry yes
just so like it's whenever we have these points where several lines come together, this is showing that there's a common ancestor of the 2 organisms coming off of it. So this is common ancestor of C and D.
단다 페리티온 두스티도아 페리티온 두스티에 가서들 톡사로스도에 디기 참 디네 야 가르디차 톡사로디 가르땡겨라 디펜치션 디네 카케로에 심제니 지어와 디네 카케용도 디참들 톡사체 디네 카케용 하시면데 디참 디기 가르땡겨라 디델 속사 가르로지여베나 심제 가르로지여베나 디디 에네 디네 카케자 펜치션나 델 톡사 가리나 디네 카케 디시드 디리도 시드 디 튜몽기 메보드 델 여버땡겨레스 페리디 켄세 투점들. Yes.
And we can see the same thing goes on for the whole thing. So this one that's in orange is a common ancestor of B, C, and D, since all of those are coming off of that branch.
Tanda shi magir di riba wama dela tebena. Delia tusam di dela tudoa. Digi dine tu on the dine ka ke de kardo B C D ka ke doa. Di indi digi delia sosa kardo jina di B C D gi ane themoge mebo imba tingures. Yes.
And then just one more thing to mention about these phylogenetic trees, and you can see it over here at this arrow, is that what this is signifying is time. So going from, so going from past to present. And the thing to keep in mind, this is a really, really long time. This is not happening, at least for most organisms, this is not happening very quickly.
Tanga zo dirwa di tanda chode perim ki dongbal yatte yon de semnan le sha go yakare na dine ya daji ya tang do dine da tang de na du che en gang del ya ni du se dire do di indi di wani ya khadu chi bi narwa dinzo di ngama ne chin tade bado tujuji ta tuje da jawa yuji kor ke shi yo che tuje de kala ore gyo shu mai ba shu teu chin kese di indi simje nang le ya khadu yin ba na ya gyo di dre le ya shu ju tu yung gorgu was tingures. Yes.
And as we just mentioned, right, that it's showing from past to present. Now I'm going to talk about two things that the phylogenetic tree does not show.
Ta ina yang tangi ene gang le ya tuju di tangi chode gi perim gi dongbo shi doa. Di gi nang le yang aju turu ngamani terem ngamani tanda badu karin droy me tingures. Ine ya tanda gela gi she gi ne do ni di ane tanda chode gi perim gi dongbo gi tema to ya kari yeme di. Ane shi gi is kari tingi mewadik.
So the
Yes.
first one that we see in this example is, like we said, this is going past to present. It does not mean that, for example, organism D is like higher or more evolved. It does not mean that. It's just showing past to present.
Tanga zo dimensions na tanda dongbo di yurim le te na dus yata go do. Yata yondi ngamani chim ngamani ni du ba ta yorwa. Yene yang di khar tingi yo mal di tasimje dus te yondi di rimba ro do masun di khashe shin do. Yene di khar tingi yo mal di la yongi simje den zo gyuro manga chimbaji phegyu manga chimbaji tingi yo mares. Kense? Yes.
And then the second one is that this also doesn't mean that we switched from organism A to B to C to D. It doesn't go in a line like that. It just means that they shared a common ancestor.
Ta niwa di khara tingyo mala digi delia tikche ndenia A da B C D ya toyon yoroshtwa. Di toya di khara tingyo la di dela socha khara yoba di A B C D gi me tomong gi maboji ge ba dewa jingma doji gi ani A ni B la yorwa B ni C la yorwa C ni D la yorwa la jura di yang tingyo mares di spirit di.
Okay.
Yes.
Now we have a challenge question for everyone to discuss. Are these two phylogenetic trees showing the same thing? So are they showing the same common ancestors?
Tangan zo delia piri ni doa. Shingdong le delerwa. Delia phylogenetic dongba ni yewa dinang logi. Dini chikpa tinggi does takangdar. Chikpa tinggi Marwe. Okay. So I'll ask them to like raise those who says they are same and then those who says no they're different. Ane chikpa yi langi din zo lakwa janga inda. Dini chikpa re langi suya. Dini chikpa tinggi do sengi. Di dongpa ni di chik di dang di chik dingi. Dilte song ane chikpa re chikpa re do So we have two people saying these two are same. Chikpa re langi rwa. Anda chikpa mare langi. Lakwa janga. 라고 양스냐 콘소 통구래 양신으로.
A lot more.
Okay, yeah, there are a lot more who are saying it's different. These two are different.
Okay, let's talk about this a little bit. Maybe someone who thinks that they're the same, can they give us a little bit of a reason why they think these are the same?
Tang zidi ko le ya tis chikta ye rui ne ya di ma she khong le ya tangi chikpare la nge jiwa. Chikpare la nge jigi mi jigi andi chikpare kharshin la me gyumze shero chigi bes. Tumo mayin be mebo chik chayo dos shwa. Ale kapcho loga khasa gonda yergi kapcho di ma to shemba tumo mayin be mebo yoba chikpa tenga. Mebo yoba chikpare la. So almost I think there were three people or some. They were saying that they're saying that these two trees do show that a common ancestor in both the cases. The only difference that we see in the branching structure of this tree.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to go through this a little bit step by step to make sure that we all can see that it's showing the same common ancestors. That's a good.
Ta gela rimba thang chik chintung ge yes di chine ning anju mebo chik wa se di khandes teng ge me khasero tanga chit lo. Yes.
So when we're looking at the phylogenetic trees, we really want to keep our eye on these connecting points.
당간주 단다 초대기 디지와 페림기 동보세지와 원델 따요데 가주 믹 따서로데 내가 치슈지 거왔다고 올라디 델 튀참시도와 튀참되게 거와도 델다고 오레스. Yes.
So the first one here, if we focus just on this connecting point, we see that it connects to C and D. And when we look over here, the connecting point is the same. It also connects to C and D. And this order of the flipping doesn't matter.
다 맞아 디니 때베나 비링이 때베나 디 튀sam될 때베나 디 튀sam디 거알라레샤 시다 딜라 튀도아 해도아 다나시 디 비리들 때베나 디 튀sam디 시다 딜라 튀도아스 케세 시다 디 딜야 시 디 튀와다 딜라 디 시 튀와 고림 추와들 케바르 케스요 말레스. Yes.
And it's the same for the next one. So at this connecting point, when we focus on that, we see it connects to B over here and over here, D and C. And it's the same thing, B on this branch and C and D on this branch. So that one's also the same.
투섬 이외될 때 왜나야? 그래서 네 투섬 될때 왜나야? 이게 나오려야 네 투섬 되니 B레도아. 안데니야 쳔바나 C다 D레도아. 그봐. 다나신 네 투섬 될때 왜나 네 투섬기 초직리야 B체 초셰바들이야 C다 D레도아스. 디인디 디니 버로리야 투섬기 카케당로도 무슨 집어 차이어스.
So this is, it's good to keep in mind when we're looking at phylogenetic trees that sometimes just because, sort of when we look at it quickly, it looks different. It's important to look at the connecting points because that tells us the information we need to know.
당한 저기 단다기 소대기 페림기 동벌이야 때용디 가디 인바이네야 내가 체 따서디 걸러나 튀섬 가와래샤. 그래서 튀섬 될라 때치네 니주로 무슨 수라야 가르가르도. 라 디다고 그래스. 안줄 하버도 따닐다 용디. 라. Yes.
Great. And so this is what we just talked about. Yeah, so we can say, so we just talked about the conclusions that we can talk about in terms of how these different organisms, A, B, C, and D, would be related to each other based on those connecting points.
당한 저기 당기 페링이 있다에 봐. 동분일 때에 봐. 디 동분일 왔다 체네 인간주 domsi khari ya tu yebadi tana ngaju chudur chebadres kense tad pension asimje A B C D C da A B C kasa B D C A khonjo gi tamme bitomong me bod khane khane reshe chikpore domen da yati ngaju tasembres. Yes.
Okay, I think we're ready. Yes, so now we're on to number 2. First evolution concept that we wanted to talk about was phylogenetic trees. Now it's done. And now number 2, let's talk about fossils.
또 당보들와 먼저 폐교릭보다 제외 여기 내들 당보디 당기 단다 소디 페림기 동보세 때서와 단 내들 니와디 가르쳐 열라나 fossils 라나 줄도 귤도르와 귤도 체결했어.
And in this picture, what we can see, so what we're looking at here is kind of, this is all the ground that's layers and layers underneath the surface that we walk on. And we can see that there are many different layers here underneath. And so we don't usually even see these or know about these or think about these.
Tangan se di peri delia ta yong dirwa karta gyo la di sawo walia. Kense se walia ani rimba mangbu shuju yu delia ngas ta gyo res. Di ding ngas nam gyo yimba na ngas de gang la ya do de di wa de la samlo yetang samlo yeshara khorgi marla mi yeshara thong mares. Ina ngas thering ta ya di ani se gyo walia rimba khazu shigi me. Kense ondi peri di ta gyo res. Yes.
And the reason that we're talking about fossils in these different layers is that when people have found fossils in these different layers, that gives us some evidence for evolution. So it allows us to study evolution and how it actually happened.
Tangan se di rimba doa. Kelagi ani jurdu gi rimba de layer thangbu layer ni wa dini roz doa. Peri do de la rimba do doa. Tongu doa. Rimba manda se di kelagi lawa khare la na. Tandangan ju figure bal lobjong che yondi. Kese figure bal lobjong che yondi. Rimba manda rasha gyogi ani jurdu de yorwa. Jurdu dinji ani ngazolia figure begalya nyamship cheya. Kese an figure ma de khane chongsha. Diganlia 심주치에다 빵달이야 시우지 핑계요레스. Yes.
And depending on where the fossils are found, so depending how deep in the layers they're found, that gives us information about how old that fossil is.
당나시 디 유르도 될 때면 림바 망고도아. 근데 디 사워 되기 때문에 림바 망고도아. 사 림바 될이야. 또 림바 칸이 니샤 유르도 될이야 시샤베 토네. 벤시나 림바 될라 여다 림바 될라 샤 여다 림바 될라 두와지라 유르도 포르리아 아니 유르도 코랑 로체 가지시 친사 세디게 네주데 양아주 라도 요레스. Yes.
So I've got another question for you. This is a picture, and we can see here now. This is picture. We can actually see all these layers. And my question for you is, which layer do you think has the oldest rocks and fossils? And so your choice is A up here, B in the middle, or C down here.
Di gelagi peristendoa. Quando di ridostendoa. Takana didi delia rimba mangbuore. Doa rimba A B C. Due. Di indi dinzus nanglogi rimba kawalia ani chagdo ningshu di tang ani tanda gyurdo ningshu di nigiri samgutus. A B C nanglone. Okay. Oh, the lawajanga de doa. Yakuta shwa. Jake ni sum. They have the color coding page, so I'm asking them to raise it. Chiwa kusese. Shilhase nangla camera. Okay.
That's yellow.
Okay, so most of them are showing C.
Okay, and why? So why did they choose C out of these options?
C 담임바. C 가르치는 담임베스. 남예지기 계시엔다. 알레 림바디 마셔드르실래요. So they're saying because we can find the oldest rocks and fossils in the sea layer because it is the lowest one basically. The lowest layer that we can see in this picture.
Yep, yeah, exactly. And that is how we get some of this information about the age of the fossils. Is we know that generally older fossils will be in that lower layer, like you said. And from that, we're able to actually study them and look at evolution of organisms over time.
다 캐랑길 남바드 다가라 레스트라 디인디 디기 림바 망고질이야 림바 마셔디 낭로리야 가두임바나 유르도 닝셔디기라요레스 켄스웨 유르도 닝셔디길이야 때체네 엔 드디겁스 심제 간데로지레체 데니야 아니 폐교 간데로셰 디가네 양아주 심주치 두고요레스. Yes.
Okay, so now we finished the first two. We talked about phylogenetic trees, we talked about fossils, and now we're going to review Darwin's 4 postulates.
당한지 당기네들 시간을 계시긴 라서 폐교리 받아 들어요. 당보드 차버려, 이보드 차버려서 숨바디 칼라나 다윈기 도수 시세야지 예스라 디간을 계시긴. Yes.
So this is where we are going to start to think about genes and cells, as someone mentioned at the beginning.
또 당기 안에 먼저 지웠당 용도 안에 가시기 릭제세야 다 차봉세야 되는 거시에서스라 또 디기 대체데 당로야 먼저 릭제다 차봉 걸이야 망아지 용구레 스네 주 시바지 yes.
And for the first one is, so the first of Darwin's four postulates is that we know that any given population has some variation.
또 다른게 두세 시도아 다른게 두세 시 당론데 두세 당보디 가르치려나 두소라나 미 뭐냐도 좀 교해 봐 딘레직 당로리야 안 낭세 나가 말아 먹고 요래라지라 나초 말아 요래세 드레스 두세 당보디.
And this little picture that's on the screen, it's meant to be just a very simplified version of a population where we have some variation. Since we have these two different colors, we've got yellow and black.
또 네 비리시도아 디디 벳 코란 탑 데우 슈지 소두 탑 데우 슈지 비리리야 거샤 유즈레스와 디벤시나 세우다 낙부도아 니조디 가르기 때문에 칠라나 소두디 낙라리야 나가마다와 봐 낭세 미라와 유에기 체도 땡에기 체 최에기 체도 가서 디베시 당시에스와 yes.
So the second of these postulates is, we already mentioned this, is that this variation can be inherited through the DNA, and it's inherited from the parent to their offspring.
다 단기 지기 라바나시 아니 다른기 되세 니버디 가르차기열라나 단기 나소이랑시 칼랑다 나가 망보열라사 낭세마다 망보열라사 디 낭세마다 디 파마 유치니 수수 보고래야 아니 DNA 유니마 아니 유배치기열스 했어 yes did it
And I'll come back to that when I
no worries they have the printed version so they can see as you go along yeah
excellent. So the third postulate, and this starts getting into the selection part of the evolution. The idea here is saying that, out in the world, when organisms are trying to live in their environment, resources will be limited in some way. So only some of the members of the population will go on to survive and reproduce.
Gelagi daringi desu sumbashtua. Desu sumbadigi and also demdru sejua. Di kolia mangaji shigireswa. Desu sumbadi karela yole the ngazo kuriujinal tsogurwa. Kuinalalia tsoy the kuriugi tungo the pejatangurwa. The in the tungo the kadu in a tishi jiris, de la du calore. Bebelulu maimbach. Kenswe. Tishi jin do tak kasheji sotoyata and kasheji kipechitures. Kenswe. Didi kara demdu that ever you nedunji chagures. This is somebody. Yes.
And last one, number 4, is that some individuals in the population, they will tend to survive better or they'll reproduce better than some of the others. And so that means that they'll have more of their offspring in the next generation.
This is Shivadi. Keswe. This is Shivadi colored and the Sodi Nangli among Yurwa. You did Nangli, did Nangli, Gerbaka, Chick, the Shen, the Dursona, any color Kibe Yayoya, and the Tonia Yayoya, Yungures. Di Kengi, Jab Jimadelia, and the Kibe Yaga, the Tony Yaga Chitungi, the Jogi Pugu Tang the Mason, the Manga Yungures. Kesa. Oh, yeah, yes.
And so in our sample population here, it could happen that there would be some conditions that might allow the yellow to reproduce more. It also could happen that some conditions would allow the black ones to reproduce more.
Tadi peri dele tebe na. Anzu chodu naga gonda chodu naga chöyegi chidu karchaso. Dida chodu nanglogi nangse yeba chöyegi chidu ninzo yeba chesoa. Di indu gonda sewu dang nakbo idungodo. Jesan nedang kashe nangloliya sewu gijig dinzo ani kibe yagatan chone yaga chöy yongzigires. Yang koryu shemba nedang shembege waliya nakbo nangloliya tar kanda ri kariro juyobena dinzo kibe yongayada chone yaga chöngagi nedang de yongzigires.
And
Yes.
for this one, we said this is kind of a simple example population. And now let's talk about the idea of variation with some real examples.
Ta Tadi tabdi shu chene en nangsi naga mangbo yoba da yeba mangbo yoba di ene ten ki chid resra. Ta ina nga zo ki dile yang ting saba chene en nangsi naga mandawa di kandes yungu me kolya nga zo chikta ki yensra. Yes.
And so variation can happen with all different kinds of traits. We're going to look only at some examples. But with this one, so we see some puppies and then we also see some people. And with both of these, we see that there is some variation in the color, either their coats for the dogs or the color of their skin for the people.
당기 나서 연구를 해주기와 디디 초대 가르쳐주나 용스인베네 용식이 됐어. 디나를 가르다 미다 키이스된도와. 디데서나 미 코랑기 샹당다 딘주 빡베기 뜻신도 이날에 강달 당디기 개발 용도라. 마다 용구도와. 딘상 마다 요도. 다나시 키딘줄 때베나 양 아니 당 칸도 마다 용요레스와. Yes.
And like I said, right, we see variation in all different kinds of traits. And another one of those is height.
다 gelagi delte di peri di karda jore sukuring seda jawa. Kise? Yes.
And so in this picture, what they did is they asked this group of people all to line up sort of in order of their height. So over on this side, we've got kind of the shortest person in a group, and then it goes all the way over here to the tallest person.
또 디딩은 저기 디디 미든 줄아 수술 수부기링 체라 시샤니 이 방은 진이 랑주 요르스라 디 타마들 가자 디기 70cm도 디디 따디는 수부나는 때문에 링체 통시돼 그래서 cm 죽주렉 숨체 근데 리그리그리체 엔타마 링시데 될 요르스 yes.
And so this is, it's interesting because you can see in this middle height group, there's way more people there than there are at either of these farther edges.
근데 베리디 얌전부 쉬우지 그랬어. 네 가신라면 아주 수비링세 끼마시도아. 끼마디 빠트코로 망아요레스. 타이니디 돌송와이나. 끼메 낭르야 미창디 망아도아. 미처 가서 미창가디 망아요레스. Yes.
So the idea of variation within a population, usually that's something that we know really well. We see it all the time. We see, people look different. We see the animals look different. And the idea is we maybe just don't always think about it, that it's this variation that allows within nature that will allow sort of the selection and evolution to occur.
So you mean these differences that we see are not the features that allow us to survive in the selection? Sorry, can you repeat that point?
Yes. Yeah. So, and this will come up in the next slide too. But so I'm just saying, the idea of variation in a population is what allows evolution to occur. And because so this is what I'll clarify is. Any of the traits that are selected for in evolution are already there in the population. So they won't pop up only because they're helpful, but it'll be some natural variation that's already there in the population.
땅아지들이야 나조기랑 통화했어. 딘조디 애니 나조기 다 촌에치야데 딘조리야 펜토 아니 진 상가만이 용돼야 지그레스. 그래서 딘조가서 탄다 통화해야 되고 양야레스. 디 로버 투게라야 도글은 레샤데 바이 상가만이 요돼 와지. 아주 랑싱기 나조기랑시 가레로지 통고여면 낭세 마라와 가레로지 통고여면 나만에 에치네 탄다 받으면 유니 용돼야 루치크와. Yes.
Okay, so this one, you all can use your cards too. But out of these, which one is the easiest for you to see out of these four choices? The easiest, I think, mouse to see.
안래 계란 소리 슈구주와 ABCD주와 디페스당 알더라. 주와 칼라도 들레 페리직 니숨 시도와. 딘조 당라 딘조 상마 찌지르도와. 찌지 인사를 리봉으로 찌지르시. 오케이. 딘조 당라니라 가기 통야 렐라시 도사. A 도에 B 도에 C 도에 D 도 통야 렐라시 가기 레샤스. क्या the show दियो बता क्या है show में okay so most of them are showing D.
Yes, yeah, exactly, right? When you look at this, it's way easier to see the mouse that's in D than it is to see the ones in the other pictures.
그래서 랜드 딕성 strong as this thing the 심제 di 통해야 야 D 나오는 레라셔 통구여레스 캐세 셴바드 들어송와나 yes
From this, you can imagine that in this specific environment, if it's easier for you to see this mouse, it's also going to be easier for this owl to see the mouse.
당은 저와 코리오 năng lực 랑시 năng lực nga라서 따용데 양 D năng lực 여기 지지디 통해 레라도 찍바찍양 아니 랑숑 코리오 năng lực 이야 단다 우버시면 돼 자우버디 두스 따용데 코랑게 양 D 디 레라셔 통도 요레스 캐세 yes
So this is an example of how in this particular environment, probably mouse in D, it's going to be more likely that it will get caught by the owl. And then we're going to have more and more mice that are the other colors, the colors in A, B, and C, because they're able to stay hidden better. And that gives them essentially more time to have more offspring.
디 코리오 든데시 낭러라 캐세 내당 든데직 낭러라야 nga즈 카레 하고도 라디 낙보디 nga즈 통해 렐라 낭시 쿠 우버디 야 통고도 쿠기 렐라 통디 코 사야라야 냐가도 바소는 체여와 딘디 쿠기 망아세 낙보도 망아세 디 겐기 콘소 쳐야라야 아니 제바도 바소데 체용고레스 캐세 드네 nga즈 랍 드로디 제니 랍 뉴스발타 랍 믹스다 라마세네 잡 제만델야 카르차이레 콘소기 뿌고디 망아용고레스 캐세 yes
Just one other important point, especially in this case, is to really think about the way that the organism is interacting with its environment, because this would be different. If the environment was more like the color of this mouse, then that one would be more hidden and it'd be easier to see these other ones.
디디와 체라데 카르 제와 체결라 디 코리오 점도 칸데식 딩토게메 캐세 제와 용야로치 그래서 디 나보르도아 나보르네 콘스 코 이베네 응에서데 오통고다 라 이네 콘스 때베나 코라스 이비온디 도도로인디 뜻식 미기 통야 카가요 체네 아니 개발도 수고요레스 yes
So it's good to know that there's kind of not just one set answer. The whole process of evolution is always these interactions of the organism with the environment.
당은 저기 찍걸게 시용디로와 심제 코라야나 코라를 리뷰 찍고 지금 봐봐. 셴바다 코리오 디나 용에게 셴바다 제와요 되게. 코리오 코로라야 제와요 되게. 그래서 제가 폐교를 봤어야디 심제 제라바지기 리뷰 찍고 지금 봐봐. 디 년람다 디 투직라 요뱅이 코리오 디나랑 전에 쟁에기 심제 셴바다 제와요 되제 가지고 셈나 샤고 그랬어. Yes.
And so this, I just wanted to share one final example of adaptation before we start talking a little bit more about genes.
당은 저기로와 아니 gelai rigze korliya kejamasongene tungyur sejwa adaptation sedi dedan jewa chene ngazu piri thamajik tungi inswa.
And so two reasons I wanted to share this example. One of them is just that I really like butterflies. And so I wanted to include a butterfly example. And this particular butterfly is native to Tibet.
Tadidi Parnasia chemalepseshwa. Di chemalep di korgeshinswa. Di chemalep di per round to kebe chongwe and chemalep chagures. Yes.
And so this butterfly has adaptations to that environment. Like everything is about the interactions between organism and environment. And so this butterfly is adapted to the altitude and having it be cold and the wind.
di chemalep di koran tebe na ya kuriu khare roshin nang sonne chige del ya tungyur shuksin boyong go reswa penchen di pyo nang le ya pyorang ne chongjo jin ba de sa thosa kese sa thosa ne thoya ane 장모 유바 강시들 학보 숙친부 여행이 니기 코리오 데레지나라야 거기 등교를 치도 그랬어. 그래서 yes.
And for this butterfly, it has this dark coloration. And so that will help keep the butterfly warm. And as we can think, like if we have a dark color and the sun is hitting on it, it feels really warm. And so that's what's happening with this butterfly. And the butterfly is able to keep the wings flat, just to not get taken away by the wind.
디 코랑기 치기 디 단다 쇼크도 지말라 제라바 디 쇼크다 저와치니 계시서와나 쇼크베기 짜와디 낙버르도 왜 그래도 디 짜와디 가래 팽겨를 디 콘수 수불이야 최용이야 전부냐래 별사지 토 장모여와 델이야 최냐래 디 쇼크바든 저 레블레요레스 레블레요 송장 아니 하바기 키 롱기 테드로야리야 까야기 체도 콘수기 이니 쇼크바디 레블레기 Yes.
So in evolution, this would be telling us that the butterfly didn't get to just pick that these would be helpful things. So the butterfly didn't get to choose, oh, it'd be helpful to have a darker color near the body and have flat wings. There's a different process.
랑종 피규어를 배나올려야 심지 코랑기 디 총나 야보여서 디가 전에 치도 디리아 팽기도서야 디 코랑리아 담바치기 라마로드마스네 디니지 연구요 말했어. 해서 델리아 용단디 시당로 시수 셴바직 토는 제시야고요레스. Yes.
This is another example that there was a whole population of lots of butterflies, and then because of the environment they were in, those butterflies that had the darker color and flat wings ended up over generations and generations having more offspring. And now the butterflies that we see today will look like this.
디 제말레비여 되어지 코랑 디 제말레비 단당아지 통데디 코랑 뒤다 당보 통마 되월이야 코랑 집부지 여지 많이 봐 제말레 나가 망부 쉬우지 여버체 다 규바니 규바다 미칼라 미랍네 미랍라와다 랍네 랍체니 마이 태용디 단데 참들이야 안간조 콘수 통데 마도지기 당분이니 고라 코란지 용 여버체 아니 코란기 오가들이야 케조디나 야부도세지 코라 담네 용셔야지 말이스 켄스웨 nga마데 나 제말렙 나가 망부치 단다 신행 아주디 통데 디디 칼라오다 벳 코라스 로 망부 고르치네 내가 아주디네 교와침 버지레스 yes
okay. So I'm going to do a little bit of a recap here because we talked about 3 really key things so far. And maybe I'll actually even, just so we can refer back to it, let me...
Sure.
Okay, just to review what we talked about so far is we talked about these first 3. We talked about phylogenetic trees, fossils, and Darwin's 4 postulates.
당한 저기 내들 폐교를 받을 저 여기 내들 조 숨디 가리야 그치 셰비인스와 당보디 가르샤 초두기 폐교기 동보세 주바 phylogenetic trees 니버디 겨도체 숨바디 다링기 도스 시지와 딘데 강래야 하는 거죠 디네된데 강래야 하는 거죠 그치 셰셈브레스 yes
And related to Darwin's postulates, we talked about how there is the natural variation within a population, and that because of the interaction of the organism in the environment, then adaptation is able to happen over many generations.
단다 디강 가사 다링기 도스시 나오라리야 소두직 나오라리야 낭세마다 망부 쇼주야 되버체 그래서 아니 낭세마다 요데 저기 코유냠도 야마 저바치요디 애니타메 타주들이야 들 둥겨 카데시게메 둥겨데 칸데시용게메 디 기름데 갈래야 가지고 시에레스 좋아 yes
And so before we go to this last section here that's going to be about DNA mutation, I'm going to pause for a moment and ask everyone to take a minute. They can think and talk to each other, and to write at least one question that they have about what we have talked about so far.
그게라기로 던지 시와디 니규르당 깨지마시 공을래야 아니 캐란즈 나올을 파주 깨지 시에체니라 까마지그링 나올래야 단데버드 가르가르 시에서 대다 대와 유튜브 가르가르도 지워 예배나 만탈을 지워 스스로 지워레레레 삼로 코레 탑시체다스와 Kana zu nangu mi cha chine nyeram lagi shine rigor. Di ne du sum di gang la. Yeah, this way. He said this way. So since they finished discussing and I'm asking if they have any question.
Yeah, so I was going to ask the same thing. Yes, if someone would like to volunteer to share your questions, we can talk about it a little bit.
Chua anila chikche and anika mainda. Yes, they're yeah.
Tambutira nache reshane nasane bibarida. Ani kare chembuchi simba chana de khandre chuge.
So can you please show the phylogenetic for fish? I mean whales. That yeah. So dirbe. Didi kandes chungri laimbe. So they're asking how these animals do have like a common ancestor.
Oh, so the question is, how do they have a common ancestor? Is that right?
Yeah.
And so I'll say a few things, but the first thing is that in biological evolution, there is the idea that there is actually one common ancestor for even all of the organisms that we know today.
또 나나 띵의 피규릭 배낭로라. 삼런당당 지교레스. 삼런당당 지기 갈라나 단당가지 점링 디강리야 심제리 카레르스 통구여 배네야. 창말이야 아니 메부직세디 여바직 아니 삼로지교레스와. Yes.
And this has been studied. One of the ways this has been studied is through the use of fossils. And so by going back through sort of the geologic time, but just by going back through those different layers, we're able to kind of look into the past and see different organisms that have existed at different times.
딱 저기 단기 칼로레 피규릭 보기 심주 체온디 아니 다스 찍디 귤도 차겨레스 귤도 현재 fossils 귤도를 따겨레스 귤도 대야 단기 상감을 리비토네 결시 칼로 냠십 체온디 싸기 림바 커커리아 아니 귤도 카르카르도 와 아니 가 등기 뜨여서 마 지삼기 마 대추기 닝바여다 된지가 ngama yodewa roji delia shishane en konzogi shimjuji chigiores gyurdola tachine gyurdo tayadan gyurdo di yang sai ani layers rimba khawala do di yang khebar chiksugiores ra. Yes.
Yeah, and then even more recently, so a technique that people have been using more recently as we've learned more about genetics is to actually also be able to look just at small changes to the genes that have happened over time. And in that way, we're also able to see how these organisms are related to one another.
다 탈럼로도 서셔주와 심지 판수 카레르와 도르와 유림 폐규 돈에 대해서도 가이 가라 저와 니야도 야나네 딘데다야야 타니 서셔 탈럼 서셔로도 가르쳐요라나 릭제 돈에 셔야 해세 릭제레 심지 셔야 차요레스 릭제는 줄도 지삼 긴용와 대츠기 심제 딩이기 저와 니에와이바 딘데지 돈에 가지고 셔 야투요레스 해세 yes.
And so just especially from the perspective of genetics, we would be able to kind of look back in evolutionary time, and the idea of it is that even the first original cell is that like slowly over time, over so many generations, a really long time, that we can see, oh, this change in DNA happened here. And after there's many changes in DNA, then we would say, okay, at some point, it's a new species.
달라 탑름 사슈 릭젤 다이바 릭젤 나올이야 따송도 but 잡 망보링래야 교와테야지 nga 통고 요레스트라 벤체신나 잡 찍래야 따송네 nga 릭젤나 따송에나 DNA 따송에나 근데 잡 지마 망보지래 따는데 DNA데 티스 교와도 되겠지 해세 근데 릭젤 나올래 교와드레디 nga 섬나 가디시 가르샤고 그래 교와 람사 드레 마이 교와드레야 뒤에 링부 슈즈 거게 와 땡고 그랬어 안데네 칼라 간점 지글래 손디 아니 냐예 바이나 냐 사와로 냐 사와라네 냐 셴다 만다지 퇴요야 데지 내당가 연구요레스 해세 yes
And so when we keep in mind that this happened over such a long period of time and in so many different environments all around the world, right? We're talking about the organism and the environment. So once this has been happening in all the different environments, both on land and in the ocean and everything, then that really ends up giving us this wide diversity of organisms that we
다 당기시원하시 귤도세 규폐교세디 바트코라 투주 귤링 부시오직나는래야 총아디 인지미지 셈나샤고 그랬어 얘네야 찍디 가르셈나 걸라디 귤도디양 코리오 만다 나는래야 총아야지 코리오 만다지 벤시스나 추낭나래 연구요래 싸강나 연구요래 켄스웨 딱강다 딘데지강 용어에서 코리오 만다지다 드름 귤링 부시오직강 용어에서 아니 다나가서 코리오라메라야 심제 나가 망보 Damin nazo toya di toni yung tu stingers. Oh yeah, yes.
Yes, and so we will be talking more about this genetic aspect just in a little bit, like well, actually later in the session and definitely the second one. So we will revisit this again.
Sure. 아니 저기 릭제스들의 유로 하는 스튜디오메디 띵사바디 결랑 롭센 디스치군디 치기 싫어. 어디디 아니 디스치군 쉐기 is yes.
And I think, because I'm just looking at time, I think we have time for at least one more question about this, and maybe even more, depending on on how much time it takes. But let's do at least.
Yeah. 아니 나 결랑이 데다 저 유튜브 찍링기 스튜디오 셴바직 아니 가만히 배탱기. Yeah.
어디 나디 심전데 저 아니 마치아데 란주 덴르기 왕기 아니 심전나 소용야데 란주 덴르기 켐베 용기도 아니 디 단다라 페나 심전데 데데도 미레 아니 키레 딱 민다 용야데 아니 갈지나라 란주 덴르 코나라라 레기 란주 덴르다라 아니 린제 코나라라 레기 요레 양 딜레 심베
So she's asking, so the variation that we can see in a population are like the factors for variation. Is it only the gene and the natural selection, or there are other factors that are playing in occurring the variation that we see in a population?
Yeah, this is such a good question. I'll go to the variation slide just so we can look at it together.
Sure.
Yes, so this again, so I know that I've been talking a lot about the organism and the environment, and to the point of this question is a lot of this variation will be influenced by genes, yes, as you mentioned, and influenced by the environment as well.
다 안에 like chiwa khala narwa an sode jina wala ya na so girang shi mara mangbu yong di ane rangjo dimru dang ane rigje chikpu chikire la duirwa kele khala na di benchishna di simje shwa ki rojin bana ki nangla ya nagara mera yong do chundo debe na di di naga yong di rigje gi shukya shukchim shushti yores 당나시 코라 손에 치사기 코리우기 양 안에 shukya shukchim yores yes.
And so even in the slide, there's two good examples of this. So in terms of skin color, right, and we know if we go outside and we're in the sun, then a lot of times our skin will get darker, we'll get tan.
That benchishna din on the dipid de the shandoredo, or the shayin dogaredo. Papen dogara, tap counter, Papen doga de tebina, Kashi Nabu Kashi to Shikaurido. Dipinshna on the Nimen only a chimbena. Kese, Nimen on the chimbena on the Nimet section Nabucha to us. Nangla devaleda, Nimachilo chimbena, Nimen de Nakshe would was. Yes.
And just another good example of this too is height. So height would be somewhat determined by genes, but it could also be influenced by something in our environment, such as our nutrition, such as the foods that we eat.
당시 벤시스나 수비링 셀 때문에나 그래서 케브라 망고도와 통쉐들이 링쉐들와 디 수비링 세대야 슈케디 지당 릭제기 토네 연구요레스 이나야 코리오게 대한 슈케니 찍부터 요레스 벤샤샤나 코리오데 나올리아 시주 카르카르요메 그래서 칼라이기 치료네 칼라 가르사기요메 미디 칼라 가르사기요메 디 칼라디 유진 수술이야 시주라 말하다 디 슈케기 켄데레 지치네야 수비링 셀이야 개발적으로 요레스. Yes.
So for all of these, the organism and the genes that the organism has to have the traits, it's very interconnected with the environment and how the environment is interacting with the organism and its genes.
다 심지 수수수수수리야 아니 릭제 요르와 릭제 나노리야 아니 나가 말아 요르스와 이네야 쭉 ತಕಲೋ 릭제 요바직다 강사 심지 수수 요바직자 마이바 디 코리오다 냠도 안 제와 칸데스 용고에 메디기 케버 쳔보스 요레스 라 yes.
Yeah, and yes, I actually just love this, but I think one other idea that it's just related to this that you'll especially be talking about this week is so sometimes it will be the whole organism and then interacting with the world, the environment out here, and sometimes, especially in development and physiology, it will be even a more local environment. It might be the environment within a part of someone's body.
Tayang tangi kala nidu jik dikar chayela na kuyule kebar sugile jwa kuyugi kebar sugile sedi kuyu benchi nang sosogi sonegi chi kuyu zam mayin ba yang sugbe nanglogi nedangi kebar jigin goyores kense nangi kuyu didang yang chi kuyu zam mayin ba jik sugbe sosogi ta kangdar kamgi nedang juyorwa lunkamgi nedang digi yang kebar jig sugiyores. Yes.
Okay, great. So I am looking at the time. I think we will talk about our fourth idea now. And definitely we'll have more time for questions later. But for the moment, we'll talk about the fourth idea, which is mutation.
당아주 내된 시와들 따기 그래서 뒤서 당서와 나 지와 망아지네 레야제 단 내된 시바디 가르쳐 요래 니규 그래서 mutation 나나 니규제. Yes.
Yes, and so I think this is really good. Even before this, we already started talking about genes and variation, and mutations play an important role in that.
따디 갑도 딜롭센디 뒤에 야구시 차송스 같이 라바데 딩게는 아주 릭제스는 깨지시 여러스트라 아니 릭제디 나올리 따 칸더 니규르디 칸데시 슝고에메 콜레야 케시야 여러스트라. Yes.
And so, as we can see here, kind of the definition of a mutation in this case is that it is a change in the DNA sequence.
다 니규르 세스도와 니규르 세디기 체니를 그렇다 낭도 고된로디 델이야 샤요레 갑디 갑수 먼저 디케지 시행 갑수 니규르 세디 칼라나 DNA기 차출이야 규르도 침바들라야 규르도 코란이야 니규르슬란다 요레스와. Yes.
And when we're thinking about this, cells need to pretty quickly make a copy of all of the DNA sequence every single time they're dividing.
Tangan zirwa nigir say digi shay undi kupsu chabong dirwa chabong ani khatu ani khasa kha khebe ina keswe yana ne phegyu droba ina ya tidu kapsu khadu imban dinang lo khora le yu DNA jirwa ti khadu nang rashu chi go goresta khadu gyo khadu pha chabong kha khebe ne tidu kapsu ani tuju tundu jinang lo gyokbo shuji ani rashu chi go gores rashu se na kare copy chi go gores. Yes.
And so maybe this is a question for you all to think about is, let's say that there's an example that I asked you in the next 5 minutes that you had to copy down all of the notes that you've gotten so far in your science classes. Do you think that you might make a mistake while you're recopying all of these notes in only 5 minutes?
Ta gela ki pensis na ma chiwesh tangi inshwa. Tan gela kisi gela girwa kiran sula kamanga nanglo liya tanda ba dolab sha yogi tsiri ki sindi changma ma pe shu shus lawe na. Kense ma sindi ya sho ya na pe shu shus lawe na kiran ki diporo liya nondu yungure samku dues. Yeah, they think they'll make mistake.
Yes, I definitely would too. And so that's similar to what's happening in the cells. There's a ton of information for them to copy there in the DNA sequence. And so sometimes a mistake will happen.
That 찍어지게 gela in the nudich sareswa. Tana 찍어지게 차봉 나올래야 용단 로즈와 디랑 찍어지게 res. 아니 디랑래야 차봉 나올래 이바이나 단다 DNA 다시 치엘이야. 아니 말아 로가 요레스. 계세 샤샤로도 마스 말아 로가 제 아니 림바도도 마스네 말아 용구 요레스. Yes.
And so this is a normal process, and it's what leads to that diversity, that variation that we see within populations.
Tadi indu tanda ngaju chabung nangloliya tanda nutrishorde ta kandar DNA pishu chidi chig yungudwa nutrishorde aji hoda digi ani chodu ni nangloliya na zogi rangshi yongya di gyune yongu yores de la tenchine kese. Oh yeah.
And so
Yes.
another question for everyone. Would you say that mutations, so there's 3 options, I didn't make a slide, but there's 3 options. Are mutations good, bad, or like neutral?
Ta gelagira dinalaliya mixe te marsine gelagi chiwash tangi instrua ani nigurdi yakbure samgudwe yanane dugjare samgudwe yana kebar digaski sugu mar samgudus. 약보르웨 오케이 약보르웨 둑제르웨 아니야 즉 땅염로 직신으로 개발시라면서 약도니가 매겨로 직 니가를 랭이라고 jan다 약도니가 이를 랭이라고 jan다 땅염를 랭이라고 jan다. Okay, so some people are saying it's I mean the mutation is good as well as bad, and some are saying neutral.
Okay, good. So essentially, everyone is correct in some way, because sometimes, depending on the environment, there will be an effect that's helpful for survival. Sometimes, depending on environment, it might have a negative impact on survival. And sometimes it just doesn't change anything. So basically, all of the above. Everyone's correct.
Oh yeah, ta gelak ani like haran zule gaya ba. Ta di color kan zum changma ro chagyores. Digba chagyores. Kajin labena nigyur jik tepso na koyu koran le yashishani. Nigyur khashejigi simjendi koyu dinang le ya chone chia pingres. Kese khashejigi nigyur rik shembajigi koyu dinang le ya chone chia le ya nugyores. Rado ne na duga ro charugro. 아니 카시지기 야 리지 가서 니규르 카시기 야 코리오데 나는 케바르치 수고 말스 네슈데가 슈게데가 스티기 말스 디인디 가가 내당 따당 마라마라 따윤디 아니 케란스 딕데요레스. Yes.
All right, and then just to look at this picture here real quick, it's showing us an example. And so we have the original DNA strand here, and then we can see in this example, it made a correct copy. And so in this case, the correct one is purple, but in the mutant copy, it just so happened in this case that there's this yellow that got inserted instead.
당연히 당연히 니규르 탭당 시도아 니규르 탭당디 먼저 DNA 피슈치디 곱스 칸데 용거면 되더라 답변치스나 디 DNA 디 마베라디 카레 아마데레 켄세 니네 추사바지 피슈치고 거 켄세 디디 러시 딱다 디기어레스 벤치스나 디 춘도 디 델리아 콘조기 디 가사 칼레데 퍼블 시텐도아 디 춘도 디 여베난 델 딱다 데요레 이나야 니규르기 러시디 나올레 가르치도 춘도 가르샤 세월에도 디 누구나 딱다 치유나 디 연구거래 이내야 니규르 탭치니 디 차요레스 켄세 누구데 어야 디 인디디 가르쳐셨더니 니규르 탭도 마베도 때문에 딱다 돼요 말 yes.
And one more review question from this slide. So in this image, what do each of these represent? So we'll have to kind of recall, but what would we call these, all the different pieces of the strand of DNA?
땅가 저기 단다 DNA기 탁거라 봤더니 탁거라더라 탁바디 나올려야 되네로도 될 장구지 될 마오지 될 장구지 될 세우자도 딘줄에 갈래 그랬어 니 가르스 탁한다 아 SGC래 ACC 니어베 ACGC래 Transferes ACGC le que chestan. Shima de Yomares, Karagariore. Okay, so they're saying there are 4 different types of this kind. So one is A, C, G, T. Okay, so they got it. So ACGC.
Yes, that's great. And we're going to be talking about that more. So I'm really glad. I'm glad that you all remember those parts.
Tagala gola dikolia ya. Jenny tagiwashi israni. Dizutik sons ra. Yes.
And here they are.
Delesa. Yes.
So just to recap, as we talked about, the cells are quickly copying all of this information contained in the DNA sequence. And so cells make a mistake every so often, just like we would if we had to copy all this information.
Tadi nanglolia chabong kaji kigyur ka drwe kapsu den sama beshi chigo la swa. Tingde di beshi chen di kaji di changsu se di ADGC phangrim derda. Kese di indu di gi ane khadu dashi chewena DNA gi nodi shashar baro cheyores ta khanda shodu yores wa nodi khala na tuju tundu shinal tokoyo chigo gorwa di genge. Yes.
And just this one, this example is a little bit more detailed than the previous one, because now we're actually looking at this exact sequence of DNA. And so we see the original at the top, and then we see that in the one at the bottom, this mistake got made. And so now the bottom sequence has a mutation where there's the C instead of the G.
다 디디르와 만족이 DNA 나올래야 니규르 간데 슝게메 데터 림바드르와 다 디디 마베드레 케세 디디네 마베드레 디카라 다시드레 다시디다 마베드니 ATGC기 방림 돌송와이나 디디 가차도 지 살라 실레도 디디 디 니규르 탭기요레스 셴바사마 결혼 좀 믹다와나 찍거로래 상마 케세 yes.
Okay, and so this, I'm just going to do one last quick review of these, and then we'll actually, I reserve the rest of our first session for questions. So we'll have 15 minutes or so for questions after I do one more quick review.
tadi karta yo medero dindi ta zinda thama kama changa silhado dinzu ani ganzo chiwa challenge is ra.
So for this session, when we were talking about evolution, we covered phylogenetic trees, fossils, Darwin's postulates, and
당아주 디 소디 디 낭로리야 아주 내든 시 당기 시원하시래 표교이다 저와 여기 내든 시지 그렇게 시인스와 소디기 에네 표교기 동보다 아니 줄도체 아니 다윈기 도수 시지와 안다나신 탐에들이야 니규 내든 딘주 시 당라야 아주 계지 셰브레스
And we ended the session with talking about variation and mutation in the DNA sequence, because after the break, we'll come back together and go more in depth with talking about genes and cells.
자발생 당세로와 자발생 당세는 야셰연도 아니 간주기 가사 자봉당 아니 직제 강리야 아니 망아시기스 켄세 yes.
And so, yes, so I think for now, everyone can take just a minute. You can revisit the question or questions you wrote before, and maybe there's something you want to add now that we talked a little bit more about the mutation in the DNA sequence. And then, yeah, we'll just take the rest of the sort of 10 or 15 minutes to talk about whatever you want.
Sure. 단기 아주 주둘치 레임바 당나시 지고지게 주둘치 내래 간들 계란 주기 럽센데 연결고네 결십지 체체 즉다 아니 내가 저와 유튜브 가르도 뒤와잖아 사네 샤스로 아니 아주 까마 주정을 하겨들 뒤와디 치겠어 단기 다른 기도세 봐도 아주 즉다 셈바 네가네 아니 니규르다 저와 유튜브한테 나 뒤와네 배yap지 뒤와디 계란 주기 레이싱 매우나 뒤와다 뒤와티니 샤나리고
Are there any volunteers who would like to ask a question?
아니 뒤와 당란신 땡에 왜사 yes 아니인다 어디 단기 표현하면서 양라돼 근데 호야 호야
러시아보다 논주체는 러시지도 아니가 아니 니규르베 니보다 논주체는 지네 니규르
호야 so it was mentioned like in mutation right during the copying of DNA there's both change in the sequence as well as like correct copying of the sequence. So do you mention the change only change in the sequence as mutation, or are those like the correct copy as well as the change in the sequence or copied? Both are those of both mutation, or is it only the change that is happening, the mutation?
Yeah, so when we use the term mutation, it would be referring to a change from the original copy of the DNA sequence. Yeah.
니귤세디 단당한 쪽이 니귤세디 카레라 고고일라디 DNA 마베지여와 마베디니 다슈치기로와 다시디나는 요가 가르테바디 마베도 둘송와이나 아니 강 요가 테바들이야 니귤라 그랬어 심바 따다 페슈 치투이나 아니 어디 니귤 차이가 말했어 그래서 yes 저 심바 이봐 so 안일라 찍히긴다라 라디스 yes 안일라 마이크 그렇지
Kilati gyurdo kapsura. Yang zo gyurdo sidi zambala ri nusin yang zo lendi le sidi damsa. Ina ya ngima khoya chila anzo di nyalop chen tharang da joy. Kasi ri di thangbungye la ri inde yo achira. Ani yang zo jungwa gi neba inde sayom do ji ri di khasi dus kodin lo gyo ro chi ba che. Ini yang zo gi ta thanda ri dinde kodin lo gyo dine khasi yang zo gyurdo che gyo na. Andi ning sho che mara.
Oh, okay. So her question is regarding the fossil, the MCQ kind of like ABCD choice that we did in the picture regarding the mountains. She's saying that even though we can kind of like if it is a normal process, then we can say that deeper the layer, the older the the fossils. But then in case if there was a natural disaster and there happened like some like landslide or something like where the mountains can be flipped kind of thing, then how like from that kind of perspective, it is hard to say that the layer at the sea is older than the layer at the A. So that's how she's asking. She's saying that we cannot like firmly say that it is the sea that has the oldest rock and fossils.
Yes, this is such a good idea, and I've also definitely thought about this myself.
And then di samjit be agodoswa di samlo di yang korsons ngenirwa.
Yeah, and you're right in that what I mentioned before, it's not the whole story. That's definitely one of the methods that people use to tell the age of fossils, but it's not the only method.
찍디 가르하고라나 단기 규도기 투수지와 가주 신경실에서 가주 신경만 총샷해야지 탑시 찍디 단기 안에디 사다 저와 여기 유림 딱하라는 거 림바도들 단에 탑시 찍차요레스 이내양 아니양 규도응에서 양 닝바르도 가주 닝아래도 로 가주식래샤디 가직다야 되줄이야 탑시 셰바데야 요레스 해세 디 탑시 찍부지리야 되는 거 되게 말했어 yes.
And so just one example, another way that we would need to add some information to the story if we only know these layers, is that we can actually take a look at some of the chemicals that are either making up the fossil or the area around the fossil.
So the genetic one?
So this, I'm going to think a little bit more about atoms. And
okay. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah. So and
yes.
I'll go along.
Yes. Yes. Sorry. The chick did what? That's a chick cho chick. That's a dikariola. Then the picture in the yurdo jiyo. The yurdo korangi trupcha yorwa. Trupche gi any duche den zolia tachene anzu ene di gyurdo di ningbare doe yanani nyejarang chongyore do kangdar loche kajish tosha delia shibjuji chitu yores dinanglo yongegi. Yes.
Yeah, so some of it will be actually looking at like the chemical composition, maybe of like the rock around it, and another technique that is used is related to carbon atom.
다양 탑시 셴바든들이야 냠도 탑시 니 냠도 째네들 다야 요러스와 아니야 찍디 탑시 찍디 칼라나 카본도 나로 용이 카본리야다 체네 양 아주 네 심주지 치두 요레스 괜찮아.
Yes, and so this is a really great point, right? That I only mentioned the layers, but that I think, yeah, the way that I think of it is sort of knowing the layers of the fossils gives us one piece of information, so it's kind of one piece of the puzzle. But yeah, definitely we need to gather additional information as well.
Tanda ane lagi sungai de pe nezu yakbu rest wa yakbu shuj rest ine tanda ngishu na shi tangi shu na shi gyurdo di ane ningbare de ta nyejaran chung gyure to sanga ma chung sha yire di gyurdo de lo khaja shin sa se de ta ya de nezu tadang chik di ene tanda nganzu gi pen cheshna sa ri do jimba na ri gi jimba do ma sun tan che yire ine yang di chikbu jigle te ne nezu chasang jira i mar chesan tabshe tablam sheba mangbo jile ya nyamdu te ne nganzu shimju chigu gores. Yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we probably have time for at least one more before the break.
당저 발생받은 게 만들 지워 찍 봐. 아니 가만히 봐. Yes.
Madi danda di DNA tuya de ninjut. Di chita ane di nga kela kane mangba sinyora. Ane ke ngomane ende songi dora. Ane di tuya jingi tuya junjun tuya na no chimba sogi mare so so.
알레 강 찍스니 스르베.
아니 가르치나 슈심바도 투나 가서 왕보만 상왔다 아니 담에 차기래 송도 아니 어디 찾겠는데다 세링은에라 디자 마임바 디 가르치는 영어나 아니 롱도 마ጆ래 송도
롱다 마주르 스르베. 아하.
투레스
아하.
나 롱도 마ጆ야나 아니 타르토나 가와라 투게
네, okay. Okay, so her question is about the regarding the mutation. It was, I think she has been attending your classes for a few times before, and then she said you have mentioned so many times that mutation, if there's like slight mutation, there won't be much impact. But then when there's a huge kind of like large mutation or many mutations, then it causes, like genetic impact on the people, and so they may have some disabilities that happens in that person. And then when she asked the causes for that, the real causes for the mutation, it was mentioned it's an unfortunate event. So when she asked the deeper question, she's asking for a deeper questions. What is the real cause for this unfortunate event?
So is this, I'll ask a little bit of a question in return as well. So is this sort of, and I know that we've talked about this before, but is this getting at kind of the role of karma in yes? Okay.
Intermittent. Anta di thiwadira anege ngomani kishi ta thambase insara ane odigi ta kishi yondi ane ngegi kyaransu gi ta land ro masin debadi khariyalla na ane lendel ya thugur se jura ta le gi kengi se juwa ta di pheje di insara. They're laughing.
But no, so I mean, I kind of have two answers. I mean, the first one, or not answers, responses, two responses. One is, personally, I have definitely thought about this and thought about the connections between them. So that's kind of the personal side. And I would say from a scientific perspective that science is a tool, and that I don't know that science is really having an answer to this question, but I think personally it's so interesting to think about these connections.
Yeah, so the connection between the unfortunate one and the karma?
Yeah, or even I guess I was thinking the connections between like karma and DNA mutations in this example.
아니 gelak korangi len cho tadani dige isra chigdi gelak korangi gergi samju chine kesa gergi tadanji chigdi cheri ba tadan chine cheri ton tadanji gergi ton tadan chewe na keransu gi sam labandan shi jigze ditan le se jwa dingi poru gi jwa insigres gergi tadan chine ta ine cheri ton chewe na delia ani kende de jingor sene tanda le yore thingi mindus kese kalana lungda ma yuwa se jwa delia ani le tapta ji me hapu mindus ra. Yes.
Yeah, so I would just say kind of the one last thing before we take the break, because I want to make sure that you all get to have your tea. I wish I got to have tea too. I think science can tell us that the mutation happened. Science can tell us where in the DNA the mutation happened. We can know some of the effects. But in terms of this deeper why, we don't, science doesn't tell us about that.
다 체리 토네 셰베나 니규르라 계시온 답베치 델레라 데오데 니규르더라 니규르데 데시온데 니규르 카왈라 테샤 켄스베 체리 토네 셰토에데 카레나 니규르 카왈라 테샤 니규르데 테웨 켄기 슈켄 카르리 도세 에디 셰토레스 이나야 카르제넬레 도세 기 띵 사브르 데레야 체리 토네 탄델레야 투마레스라 아니 캐나조 서저니 우 낭로치스 겔라이네 캐나조 냠도 차동야 여초가 삼고도스 So about the tea, they're smiling.
Yes.